Everyone. It's fun to be back in this role of moderating the great discussion we're going to have today. So thanks, Julie, and thanks for taking over in January. I know it's been going, I think, really well. Today we have two great speakers, Melissa Shively and Khadijah Martin. So I wanted to introduce them. I think they're going to talk a little bit, introduce themselves as well, and then show a short video, and then we'll have a little discussion amongst the three of us, and then like we do a lot of times, that we'll open it up, of course, and we'll stop the recording after their opening discussion. So Melissa Schieble is an associate professor of English education at Hunter College. She's also a faculty member in urban education at the Graduate Center. Melissa is a former middle and high school English teacher, and her research and teaching focus is on critical and sociocultural perspectives on language and literacy, young adult literature, and discourse analysis. So thank you for coming, Melissa. And Khadijah Monet Martin is a doctoral candidate in urban education at CUNY, specializing in transdisciplinary language studies, integrating the fields of sociolinguistics, applied linguistics, and literacy studies. In her own words, Khadijah's work investigates the dynamic, fluid, racialized, gendered, and class identities of youth and how they use linguistic and other cultural resources to negotiate meaning and power in schools. And I'll also add that Khadijah is a returning champion to ACERT. She's presented a couple of semesters ago, and we really appreciate her coming back. I know many of us still use some of the activities that she brought to us a couple of semesters ago. So Melissa and Khadijah have graciously agreed to come talk today specifically about their new book, Classroom Talk for Social Change, which guides high school instructors in how to foster critical conversations in their classroom and encourages teachers to engage students in noticing and discussing harmful discourses about race, gender, and other identities. I know Melissa and Khadijah's ideas and examples in the book are relevant and useful for university educators as well. They both also came to the HCAP seminars, the faculty seminars that we organized in January, and gave a great presentation there as well and discussion. So I'm sure the discussion today will be rich and really give us a lot to think about in our own classrooms. So like I said, they can take it away now and introduce themselves and fill in any gaps that I left, and then we'll have a video as well as then a kind of a roundtable discussion after the video. So thanks again, Khadijah and Melissa.
All right, thank you, Paul and Julie. And I know, just speaking on behalf of myself, I'm always grateful for opportunities just to have conversations around these really important issues with my colleagues at Hunter. We don't have many opportunities to be in the same space. I think that's one thing that, one place that ACERT has really been such an important resource for our college is, kind of bringing us together across departments and across different areas at Hunter College to have these, really important conversations. So I just want to thank you all for being here with us today, and I'm really looking forward to this next hour to talk about these really important issues. So as Paul mentioned, my name is Melissa Schieble. I'm in the School of Education in the Department of Curriculum and Teaching, and I coordinate the MA program in English education, and I'm also a consortial faculty member in urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I don't know, Khadijah, if you'd like to add anything to your introduction from Paul, go ahead, take it away.
Well, I just want to say, I'm just happy to be here. I'm a doctoral student, and I really enjoyed. I've also worked. I taught a couple of courses at Hunter College School of Education, and I see some of my former classmates here from when I took the course, the excellent course to learn more about how to teach online. So I just want to acknowledge Julie and some of my other colleagues here who I learned a great deal from. So I'm just happy to be here, and to discuss with you all and see how we can make a difference.
So we have a short video that we created for a webinar for Teachers College Press, who published our book. And so we're going to share that video. It's a little over 6 minutes, but it provides a nice overview of kind of the main concepts in the book. And then also the illustrator for the front cover of our book was a colleague of ours in special education, David Connor, who's now a professor emeritus. He retired a year or two ago at this point. So it's nice to sort of have that, just that, wonderful colleague of ours kind of as a part of this story of this work. And so I'm going to go ahead and start the video, and then we're going to engage in some discussion around some really essential, I think, ideas and topics from the book. And then as Paul had mentioned, we'll open it up to, that's true, David is still teaching at Hunter, yes. Yeah. We're lucky that he's still connected and affiliated. And then we'll open it up for some discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now so that I can play the video.
Classroom Talk for Social Change, Critical Conversations in English Language Arts by Melissa Schieble, Associate Professor of English Education, Hunter College, CUNY. Amy Vetter, Professor of English Education, UNC Greensboro. And Khadijra Martin, Doctoral Candidate in Urban Education, the Graduate Center, CUNY.
So my name is David Connor. I have worked at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of CUNY. I've been an educator for 30 plus years, and although I'm retired, I still work part-time. I was happy when Melissa, Amy, and Khadijra invited me to participate in their book by doing an illustration for their cover. And so for their particular book, I wanted to keep it simple. I wanted a classroom. I wanted an aspect of the classroom because I knew I couldn't fit the whole thing in there. And so I decided on a teacher and kids or young people. I wanted to consciously reflect diversity in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, ability, and religion. In art, we can take some liberties. So the angle is pretty much an invented one. It does allow all of the students and the teacher to be seen somewhat equally represented. I definitely wanted to show some form of engagement, so they look as if they are talking or listening or both. Some have access to a computer or a pencil or a paper. I wanted to show dynamism, to show equal participation of sorts, and that's why there are hands either up in the air or making gestures of, I guess, the way that we use our arms when we're speaking sometimes. And I wanted to make sure that it was reflective of the contents of the book, which honor the notion that everybody in class is valuable, has experiences, histories, points of view that need to be shared, that need to be tapped into. One of the jobs of a teacher is to create spaces for this to occur and to be the mediator of the knowledge that comes into the room to help bring it out, to help shape it, to help make sure everybody's represented. And so I stuck to that notion in the simplicity of the design. And I have to thank Teachers College for making it against a lovely, vibrant purple backdrop. And so to me, the purpose of a book's cover means it should stand out. If it were in a rack in front of me, would I be drawn to the cover by the title of the book, by the illustration, by the colors, a combination of all three? And so those were some of the thoughts that I put into the cover. And if there's anybody out there who wants a book cover done, you just let me know. Thank you.
Classroom Talk for Social Change is a book for English language arts teachers, teacher educators, literacy coaches, and school leaders looking for resources and guidance on how to lead difficult conversations about social identities, including race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and other oppressions in the classroom. Critical Conversations support students with the tools to speak back to injustices they encounter in and out of school, support grassroots activism among youth, and build students' literacies for full participation in civic life and democracy. The authors take readers through a framework for fostering critical conversations. The framework includes building knowledge about power, adopting a critical learner stance, enacting critical pedagogies, using critical talk moves, and embracing vulnerability. These concepts are interrelated. Building knowledge about power is necessary for understanding the histories underlying racist or sexist language used in schools. In addition, understanding how power works in society can help students unpack those issues during critical conversations. The book offers discussion of dominant narratives, such as individualism and meritocracy, that uphold the status quo, and suggested readings and resources for building knowledge about the histories of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability. When teachers engage in both critical self-reflection and critical consciousness, they enact a critical learner stance, which is a mindset that embraces the possibility for challenging, rethinking, or developing nuanced understandings about our knowledge about systems, power, privilege, and oppression. Adopting a critical learner stance requires a shift in thinking from demonstrating what we know to opening ourselves to what we don't know yet. This work entails reflexivity, empathy, and flexibility. Pedagogical foundation for critical conversations is an approach to teaching and learning rooted in critical pedagogies that uncovers how social systems such as classism, racism, and sexism operate. In English classrooms, this approach focuses on uncovering how ideologies circulate in the text from our everyday lives, including media and literature, as a critical form of literacy. Building awareness of classroom talk during critical conversations requires a focus not only on the content, but also the structure of the talk. Critical talk moves ignite inquiry, are inclusive of multiple perspectives, disrupt status quo thinking, and are action-oriented. A final part of framework includes how emotions are part of the learning process when talking about power. The book addresses vulnerability as feeling exposed in the context of critical conversations. Embracing vulnerability is a sign of growth and is an important entry point to building critical knowledge about the self and society.
Okay.
Thank you for sharing that. It was great to see the David as well with the book cover description. Yeah, and it is a great just overall framework. I mean, there's so many parts we can jump into, but I thought maybe if we could start, both Melissa and Khadijah could maybe just talk about some of those terms that I think kind of resonated for me just listening to the, there's the overall framework of what are critical conversations for you, and then those pieces of vulnerability and power and I think emotions. So maybe you could talk a bit more about how you define critical conversations in the book and in your own teaching.
Sure. So yeah, this work, I've always been very passionate about just the dynamics of classroom discourse and literature-based discussions in ELA classrooms, particularly when those dynamics involve conversations about power and privilege and oppression. And so for me, critical conversations are really conversations that are about power, that have sort of tensions in their dynamics. And that can be power that I think is both oppressive and power that is also liberating. And so, it's a term that I think is encompassing of the many different kinds of conversations that can take place in our classrooms. But the critical aspect of it is that it really focuses on our identities and our social systems and the sort of intersections of our structures and how that influences our lives and our relationships and our access to resources. I know Khadijah has a really wonderful way of talking about what this term means to her too, so I'll kind of turn things to her.
Well, excuse me, for some reason my throat's very dry. But yeah, so when I think about critical, and just to echo what Melissa said, is critical conversations are, conversations about power and privilege, and about and so they can include anything, any type of social identity, anything that we're thinking about, because we live in a socially stratified space, right? Really the entire world. And so anything can potentially be a critical conversation depending on the context and depending on the interaction, right, of the people who were in the room. And so but one of the things that I wanted to address in thinking about terms, every time I see this video, right, it's so rich, and like it's something I learned something else, right? Like I'm learning from it. And so one of the things that really you know, is surfacing for me this time around is the idea of the interconnectedness between you know, how we're taught to be as in special education, right? And the connections with that, and increase access points, right? I'm a former special education teacher, right? And so like I think about, you know, in my training, it was about, the focus was on how do you increase access to your lesson, right? How do you create as many opportunities as possible for different people for everyone to access your lesson? And so it just occurred to me that, wow, we're really, this is really a similar concept that we're thinking about in how do we prepare for critical conversations, right? Is that we really want to invite everyone. We want to be able to create access points for people from all different social identities to be able to engage with each other. And so one of the things I was thinking about also is that with the idea of building knowledge, right? As Melissa said so eloquently, like power, you know, it's we can think about power in terms of being oppressive, but also liberating, right? And thinking about what's the agency, you know, that that people who've been historically marginalized, they've also exhibited agency. So that's really important to counter deficit narratives of these communities as well, right? And so, you know, what I'm really focused on kind of this idea too, I think is really important, as it critical conversations, they this framework, it really invites us to build knowledge about power, but you know, at the root of that is you're really building knowledge about yourself, you're building knowledge about community members too, right? Like who are your students? Who are the people who are in front of you? So if you want to effectively teach them, you've got to know something, like you got to know, you got to know about them, right? You've got to know how their communities have interacted historically, you know, in the United States. You got to know where they're coming from. If they're immigrant students, we can take that time to know a little bit something, you know, about them, right? About their heritage. And also, you know, just to reiterate too, that it's important to, you know, for you to be able to, particularly I think if you're teaching, I mean, this is at the college level, but this is still, you know, many people, they need to be able to, they need to know how they have overcome, right? They need to know, they need to be empowered, right? And not thinking about it like you have the power and then you're going to give it to them, right? In like a kind of, you know, like a paternalistic way, you know, but just this idea of, you know, as a teacher, you have a really, you play a really big part in kind of reminding students of who they are, right? And of kind of giving them models of how to overcome things, and of giving them models, you know, to validate that their communities are not just deficit. So that's something that's kind of surfacing for me too, is this idea of, you know, when we're talking about power, make sure that it's, you know, we need to make sure that it's kind of from a holistic perspective, and that we're also, that we're celebrating the agency, you know, of marginalized communities.
Thank you both. It's really useful framing, especially around access to your classrooms, and where each student is gonna come from to get access to that content, and then those thoughts around power. Another piece that was mentioned in that video that I particularly, as a linguist maybe, but also as I think many of us want, someone who thinks about how we lead discussions and how we encourage people to speak up and engage in our classrooms. The piece in your book that was mentioned in the video, the talk moves, you talk about various kinds of questions and various types of discourse in a way that you can bring into the classroom that will encourage these kind of things that, you know, these on-ramps into your class. So maybe you could each talk a bit more about what are talk moves, how are they used, why are they important in leading these kind of conversations in classes?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So I'm going to share my screen again and share a little bit more detail in addition to what was provided in the video about talk moves. And I'll contextualize this a bit just to get us started. for this project, we worked with 6 English teachers in 2 what we called inquiry groups. One took place in, New York City. The other took place in a community in the Southeast. And so what we met monthly for, the New York City group met for about 2 years. We met monthly, and that group included the English teachers and included Khadijah, our colleague Amy Vetter at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, and then also myself. And during those monthly meetings, we each shared transcripts from some classroom dialogue that we had recently facilitated. And we really wanted to unpack what was happening in that transcript, right? For example, we looked at, were there any students, or did the teacher, for example, dominate the conversation? What kinds of questions were posed that produced, resulted in rich discussions? What kinds of questions were a little more flat? We really looked carefully at the discourses that were invoked in the conversations themselves, right? For example, when race and racism was being addressed, were there discourses about racism as structural, as racism as a thing of the past, which is a dominant narrative, which is what we talk about in the book as those narratives that need interruption. Was there talk about, the idea of, our society as a meritocracy? And so we really try to dig deeply into all of these complexities that occur in critical conversations, so that to really support teachers in their facilitation of this really difficult, complicated work. And so the idea of critical talk moves really surfaced from our analysis over time of teachers' facilitation moves, and also just the dynamics of the kind of talk that ensued in response to critical questions. So the idea of talk moves actually is some, had already been some existing work, mostly done in the areas of mathematics education. And so the talk moves, for example, there might be the say more family of talk moves. So as a facilitator, rather than following the IRE kind of initiate response evaluation pattern that so often dominates classroom discussion, a student might make a say something, make a comment in class, and then the facilitator says, could you say more about that, right? That's a very sort of simple talk move, and these talk moves have been identified in the literature as generative in classroom dialogue. And so we really wanted to build on that work and think about what are some talk moves that occur in conversations about power. And we found that we really were, once we used this framework, it really helped us to have a language with which to talk about and analyze and grow as facilitators and this group work that we were doing. So we came up with these families of talk moves, and noticed that, sometimes a question such as, one question that we had a lot of discussion about was, one ELA teacher, for example, posed a question, to students, how do we define oppression and why does it exist? And it's just a very, very broad question. And so we looked at how these kinds of questions served oftentimes multiple functions, right? They opened up inquiry, they could be disruptive, they could bring students in and be inclusive. And so, we put together these families of critical talk moves and tried to describe them a bit further, I think, to help us be more mindful in the moment about some strategies we might draw on as facilitators to really support this kind of talk in classrooms, but without it being prescriptive, right? And knowing that oftentimes a particular move functioned in a few different ways. And so, the fourth family that we identified were action talk moves, right? And we found that of all of the talk moves that we analyzed across these conversations over time, that oftentimes action talk moves were the least prevalent, right? This idea of, okay, we're unpacking a very powerful topic or issue, talking about oppression, talking about agency, but what actions do we, can we strategize together to do something about, take this conversation beyond just the talk that's occurring in the moment. And so it was very interesting and powerful us as researchers and also educators ourselves to use these talk moves. And I have actually used these talk moves in my own courses at Hunter College, particularly courses in methods of teaching English. And we've used them to sort of analyze conversations, and then also use them to help students generate some potential questions or talk moves that they might draw on to kind of become, better and learn how to facilitate. So that's a bit of an overview on that. Khadijah, if you have anything to add, please do. The three of us were really such an integral part of this book. So
no, you're doing great. This is I wouldn't have been able to explain it the way that you did. But again, one thing, every time we talk about it, right? It's so rich. There's more. So one thing that just that I thought about was that for the action talk moves, there's a correlation there. If anyone's familiar with with James Banks and his multicultural education framework, right? But there's there's like that, and I'm forgetting what it's called, but there's like there's like levels to it, right? There's levels to how do you teach for multicultural education, and then the last level there is actually corresponds to taking action, right? So it's encouraging students to think about like how can they then implement, right, these ideas. So it's kind of moving beyond like celebrations of people and like show and tell, and then moving to thinking more critically. So there's a really nice correlation there that could be really useful. And then also like action talk moves, I think sometimes one of the things that's come up that may come up is that people may think when they think action, like, okay, well, I've got to do a campaign, right? Like you think about like big political moves, but really, again, there's a spectrum of action. So, and I think it's really important to think about what can people personally do, within, for themselves, if they're in a, if they're in a situation where they need to act differently. Maybe they need to say something. So maybe that action, right? That action can be saying something. That action can be, being an upstander as opposed to being a bystander. So it doesn't have to be big, right? There's a spectrum of action that can take place. And I think it's really important, for people to think about that, to think about the small steps first that they can do. And then that can really make a big ripple effect. And it may be enough in the moment.
And then just, briefly, I'm going to share one more exercise because I think that it helps contextualize this work. Something we learned, I think something that surprised me the most, at least I'll speak for myself, was going into this work, we focus so much on the talk, right? And as educators, we focus so much on how do we get our students to say something, how we get, how we have produced more and more talk in the classroom. And something I think really powerful that came out of this work was that a really important part of critical conversations is learning when to listen and how to listen and when not to talk, and when, that if we have an uninformed point to make, perhaps stop and say, maybe in this moment, rather than speaking my mind, maybe I should just spend some time listening, because these are, there are perspectives that my peers have that are not part of my lived experience. And so my participation, for example, in this conversation may be better as a listener. And I think that is so crucial in critical conversations. It's something that is a part of the work on dialogue in general, is I think very sort of undervalued and needs to be more prominent. And so we talked about this practice as being critical listening, right? And again, just thinking, thinking in the moment, do I, have something meaningful to add? Do I have enough information or knowledge on this topic? Or am I better off, listening and hearing from lived experiences that I might learn from? And so we have a critical listening exercise in the book that I think also would be really wonderful to use in our college level classes, to sort of support students to, to feel that at points in time that is okay, that my participation might be as a critical listener. And so, I won't go into too much detail about the exercise itself. But I'm happy to share this with Paul, and who might be able to share it with the group. But I'm happy to send this out. But that these kinds of ways of changing the ideas of participation and how one participates in a critical conversation, I think needs to have a greater listening needs to play a greater prominence, and that can be on the part of the educator as well, and should be on the part of the educator as well. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just want to, to add to that point too, Melissa, is that thinking about the way that we like how we converse and thinking about conversations, I think it's important to, to reiterate too, that it's, we're very much focused on speaking, right? That's what we do, or speaking and writing. And so these conversations can, especially now, right, in the Zoom setting, is thinking about multimodality and how these conversations can be written, they can be spoken, it can be a combination, right, of writing and speaking, giving people an opportunity, giving people choice and how they engage, I think is, again, for thinking about inclusivity, right, that's also really important. So there's not just one way to engage, there's not just one way to participate, right? And so I think if we can open that up, then that'll also be really powerful.
I'll just jump in here to say there's a comment from Gina Riley there about, I think, who seconds this idea of listening, and this is the listening activity in our classroom as well. And I think we can get a copy, Deborah, and put it either on ACERT or send out in some way. I want to open it up to the bigger group, but maybe you both could just kind of answer, again, as somewhat of a summary, thinking about college educators, we're all in different contexts and disciplines. What are your kind of, if we haven't really engaged in these kind of critical conversations before, what are some ways we should start thinking to prepare for these things? I don't know if you want to say tips, or, as we've all, maybe these things have come up. So what are some key things you think we should consider as we start to dig in deeper to our classrooms and doing these critical talk moves or critical conversations? Either one of you can start.
Go ahead, Khadijah. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Oh, I'm muted. Okay, I'm muted now. I'm going to step up. I'll start this time. Because again, reflecting more, about the preparation for it. One of the things that came up was that it's really important for educators, right, to kind of take stock of who we are, right? So before we think that, we have good intentions and we really believe in these ideals and we want to teach our students, it's really, really important to really kind of be honest with ourselves and to assess, like what are your triggers, right? You have values, you have you have prejudices, you have biases, right? And so if you haven't really kind of done a lot of work in uncovering that and working through it, then you're probably not prepared, right? You're not as prepared as you need to be, especially in these times, to facilitate a critical conversation, honestly, right? And it's not to say, right. So I'll leave it there. But so the advice would be, identify your triggers. What are your hot button topics, right, that cause you to lose your cool? You know what they are, right? You don't have to share them out loud, but the things that kind of really get underneath your skin. Maybe it's something that a student may do, and you need to kind of, to think about that. What are some things that people do during conversations in general, right? Because we all have different ideas about what it means to be respectful, right? We have a vision of what it means to be a respectful listener or to respectfully engage, right? But we have to understand that it's very culturally located, right? And so, these are things that we need to think about. Yeah. Are you how do you, to understand that, right? And to be, so that you can preempt it and you can be prepared for it. So that if it happens, particularly in the context of a critical conversation, right, that you can, remain cool, right? You may not agree, but remember that you're still that it's a vulnerable situation for everyone. But as the educator, you ultimately have the power, right? Because you to control the space more than anybody else, right? And so it's important for you, to be able to can you be empathetic with somebody whose ideas you genuinely really, really disagree with, or that may even be offensive to you. They may not even know that they're offending you, right? But so I think it's important to practice it. So once you've identified your triggers, and you've identified your biases, before you attempt to facilitate, practice it with a trusted colleague, with a friend. Do some role playing, right? Work with a colleague, a family member, and practice some of these exercises, right? And I think that could be an effective start to trying to prepare yourself to have these conversations. And I say this speaking from the perspective of having taken maybe 1 or 2 conflict resolution courses, and that as a master's student, and that really changed my life because I learned so much about myself, right? And things, so just kind of thinking it, so I'm drawing from that kind of line of research and thinking about, how do you resolve conflict? The first part is kind of understanding yourself more and things that trigger you.
That was great, and then we have a couple affirmative comments in the chat as well. Do you want to add one more thing, Melissa, before we turn off the recording and open it up to the bigger discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, this work is never finished. It's ongoing. Every time I facilitate a conversation, I learn something new about how I facilitated. I think that, everything that Khadijah just shared is absolutely essential. And a part of it too is just to approach the work from a stance of humility as educators, right? Rather than walking into the conversation as if our own values, our own ideals are that we're kind of that kind of banking model, right, of like filling students' heads with information. I think that probably for me the most important piece of it is to be a facilitator with humility, who doesn't have all the answers, who makes that space okay to be vulnerable with students. And then also I think being really mindful of who your students are, and what potentially might be shared in the conversation. There's a part in our book where we talk about discursive violence, right? And so, I think there's an issue of ideologies that have been oppressive and harmful and violent in our society. And that something we really grappled with as an author team was how do we address these kinds of forms of discursive violence that will come up in conversations. And so that's where I think that sometimes thinking of it as that not every critical conversation has to take place in person in dialogue, right? I think sometimes journal writing, doing a critical listening exercise with documentaries, or hearing a video recorded lecture from a speaker who's really well informed on these topics. That oftentimes what one dynamic of this work is that students will share misinformed perspectives learned in their own homes and communities. And so and in particular, I think white students in particular. And so being mindful of those dynamics and being thoughtful and intentional around that. It's not that we don't do the work, but it's that we do the work with kind of care and intentionality, so that I don't, having done this work now and done this project, not providing much open space for discursive violence and disrupting that is really important work, rather than sort of being uncomfortable and saying, okay, well, let's move on, because that point that someone made is, that needs to be unpacked, but, kind of not trying to rush through it, but think intentionally about how you might come back to that point at a later time through curriculum. So.
And we talk about, I just want to say that we talk about, that was probably like my favorite part of the book. So that we really, there's a part in the book where we really, we work through that. We work through a scenario. And so if I had to kind of recommend one part of it, it would be that one, because, amongst ourselves, we really took some time, to unpack what's going on and how to address these situations from different perspectives, to ensure that we're, that we're treating everybody, that we're humanizing everyone, no matter what they're saying, right, or doing. And so I'm really proud of the work that we did, and thinking about it. So I'd really love for you all to, to visit that part and to give us some feedback, on what you think.
Great. Well, let me just give a virtual round of applause, because it was very rich, and I'm glad we recorded it, because I think there's a lot of pieces here that we want to come back to. So thank you very much just for this presentation, and I do want to give, now we have at least 15 minutes or more to comments, and you can write them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can try to call on you, or just unmute and jump in there. And I imagine Julie's also going